Chris Bishop, welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. We've got the guru, godfather, any other cool names when it comes to asymmetries, and we're going to chat about that a bit later on. So thank you for coming on.
Mate, thank you very much indeed for having me. That's very, very kind. Very, very excited to be here. And yeah, for anyone who is not tuned out already, we will be talking a little bit about asymmetry, but hopefully some other things too.
Absolutely. Anyone that doesn't know your story, would you mind just giving us a bit of a background, what you're currently doing, and then we'll dive straight in?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I actually did an undergrad degree that I graduated from in 2003 in geography. And then I kind of thought I wanted to go into the fitness industry and do some personal training. So I did that at David Lloyd's from about sort of the end of 2003-ish until 2006. From then, I got my first kind of performance-related role working at Luton Town, for a little while, which was really, really good, really, really enjoyable. But anyone who knows the history of Luton Town, they've been in administration a few times in the past sort of 20 years. My services got cut when they went into administration, which isn't surprising. I then went and worked at a private kind of healthcare / sports performance business, called Optimum. And it's like an Exos type model, just a lot smaller. And I sort of led the performance side of the business there for a little while. Whilst I was there, went and did my master's at Middlesex University, where I currently teach. And that was from 2011 to 2012. Post MSc, I went and did a little bit of helping out down at Middlesex for 1 year. After that year, I then got offered some more kind of solidified part-time hours. 2014, a role came up at the university, and I was fortunate enough to get it. Have been there ever since. Initially teaching on the undergraduate program in sport and exercise science and strength and conditioning. 2016, I took over running the master's program in strength and conditioning from my colleague, Professor Anthony Turner. And then I still do that now. I also oversee all of the postgraduate sports science courses at Middlesex University. So I have this additional Director of Postgraduate Programs role, which is good when things run smoothly and has its challenges when, things like staff leave, but I'm sure you could say that anywhere. And then that's taken me up to where I am now. And then I guess in the middle of that period from sort of 2017 to 2021, I was also on the board of directors at the UK Strength and Conditioning Association. That's probably the whirlwind summary, mate.
Absolutely. That sounds good. Right. I reckon we dive straight in, because we've got a list as long as your arm to go through. So let's dive in. So anyone that knows you, even though if they don't know your backstory, they'll have read at least, surely people that are listening have read at least one of your papers and will know you from the asymmetry side of research, but then moving into the use of force plate data and choosing the right metrics and all that kind of thing. So we'll dive all the way into that. But what do we know about asymmetries? What do we know and what don't we know about asymmetries?
Okay, so I reckon anyone who's come across any one of our papers has probably looked at the abstract and then gone. So this podcast is really quite good because I'm guessing that actually people haven't read the work. Okay, what do we know and what don't we know about asymmetries? Okay, so predominantly most of our work is focused on performance rather than the injury side of things. From the link between asymmetry and performance can probably be divided into two kind of relatively rough key areas, right? The first is looking at associative studies, so people who have designed studies that look to correlate an asymmetry index from one test with performance in another test. So that could be something like jump height asymmetry from a single leg counter movement jump test, and let's run relationships or correlations with how fast you run during sprinting or change of direction speed tests. Now, I did my systematic review on this for my PhD, and I look back at my systematic review now and I think, oh God, there's definitely some improvements that I'd make on that now if I did that. But that's science and we learn and all that stuff. The overarching summary for those types of studies is that they've kind of been split into asymmetry being measured in strength tasks, jumping tasks, sport-specific tasks, and then there's a few random ones that have been measured in sprinting, anthropometry, balance, and things like that. And then each of those asymmetry metrics from any one of those different physical characteristics or tasks has been correlated against some other kind of independent task in sport or physical performance. Generally speaking, the strength asymmetry studies indicate that the larger your asymmetry, the worse you do on the task. Remember, this is all associative study design, so it's not cause and effect. The jumping studies, I would say probably are roughly 60-40. Okay, 60% being the larger your asymmetry during jumping, whether that's bilaterally or unilaterally, the worse you do on an independent task. Okay. The sport-specific tasks, I'm probably not as up to date with them as I was, when I was doing my PhD. I found 8 at the time when I did my systematic review, and we're going back about 6-7 years now, and 75% of them said if you're asymmetrical within the sporting task itself, the outcome of that sporting task is not as good as it could be should you be more symmetrical, should we say, right? So an example of that would be in swimming, they would tie swimmers, with a tether in the pool. They would get them to swim, measure their peak force or their impulse asymmetry in the water, and then relate that back to how fast they do a 50-meter, trial in the water. Okay, that would be like a sport-specific type study design. And then interestingly, the sprinting ones show the exact opposite. It doesn't matter, how asymmetrical you are during the action of sprinting, doesn't make you any slower. Okay, that's what the evidence from those correlational study designs tell us. And I'm probably not as up to date as those study designs in the last 2 years or so, but at one point, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, there was about, collectively across that domain, there was maybe about 30 studies, and roughly about 69% of them showed that if the asymmetry is larger, there is an association with doing an independent task worse rather than better. So, and then there was one study in cycling that fell under the sport-specific banner that actually said the larger the asymmetry, the better you do in a 4-kilometer time trial. I think it was something like that. So it's rare for there to be an association between larger asymmetries and better performance. It's more common for there to be an association between larger asymmetries relating back to worse performance. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that, virtually every study out there, nearly all of them, have just been conducted at a single time point. Okay. And I think single time point studies have their limits, and have their limitations. And the reason why that's important for asymmetry, in my opinion, is because asymmetry is a very, very noisy construct. Yeah, it's we have left legs, right legs, we have dominant or non-dominant, injured versus uninjured, however we're defining it. Each limb has its own noise when we test, whatever the test, whatever the metric is. Then we create this relative percentage number that combines that set of data, and that typically adds more noise to it. And that's usually reflected in a very, very large standard deviation in the group mean data relative to the mean value. So you might have 10% asymmetry for 20 athletes. That's the average asymmetry value in jump height, for example. But the standard deviation of that number might be 8% or it might be 9%. So my standard deviation is 80 or 90% of my mean. And that is massive compared to sort of typical performance related metric, like jump height itself, or peak force, or sprint time, something like that. Where for those performance related metrics, we might expect a standard deviation of something like 10 to 30%. So what does a really big standard deviation mean, and why does that matter? Well, that tells us that there's a lot of within group variation going on in the scores. And when you look at test-retest designs on asymmetry, it's common for the group mean asymmetry value not really to have changed much, but that's because group-based statistics rely somewhat on the value of the standard deviation when you're testing for differences. And when you have this massive standard deviation, it stops you from finding differences. So the story then becomes there's no change between session 1 and session 2, or point A or point B. But when you start looking at the data on an individual level, each individual, athlete's asymmetry scores from session 1 to session 2, or time point this to time point that, there's enormous change. Some people have a magnitude of asymmetry at 20%. Next time it's 6. Some people have an asymmetry of 7%. Next time it swaps sides to the other leg, and we'll talk about directionality a bit later, to like -5. And so the mean value kind of evens itself out somewhat. But on an individual level, it's gross, huge changes. So when we start trying to quantify relationships between asymmetry and performance, when there's that much change from session to session, and even trial to trial within the same session, who's to say that you would get anything like the same results again the next time? Okay, so I think there's some real limitations to that kind of single time point associative study design. And let's, let anyone who's listening know I've done plenty of them. And, anyone I'm criticizing myself just as much as anyone else there. The second domain is training interventions, okay, from an asymmetry and performance standpoint. Now, an ex-MSc student of mine did a really nice meta-analysis on this, and there wasn't loads of data. So, some, statistical experts out there might say, well, was there enough to really do that? We found 8 studies. What we found was a series of within and between group study designs. So what that means is for within group study designs, authors have designed a study where they collect data at baseline, then they collect data after a training intervention. Maybe it's 6 weeks, and it was a strength and power training intervention, training twice a week, for example. And then they measured asymmetry pre and post, and they're seeing whether the same people, reduce or increase their asymmetry after the intervention. Now, the differences slightly favor, doing some training for that group. But because there's no control group, we don't really know in those studies. Actually, you could do nothing and be in a control group and still get the same effect, because actually the change in asymmetry during those within group study designs were pretty small. And importantly, what we also don't know really is if I change my asymmetry, does that make me do a task any better? That's really the important question. Everyone seems to think about asymmetry, and intuitively you think, oh, there's this imbalance. I should correct that. But actually we don't really know if we should. And then for the studies, and there was only a couple that used a control group, again, it seemed like if you were part of the intervention group, you would reduce your asymmetry more than being in a control group. But it was very rare to reach, any meaningful significance when we run the stats on it. The other thing was when we were classifying these studies into different asymmetry outcome measures, like single leg counter movement jump height asymmetry, single leg broad jump distance asymmetry, single leg lateral jump distance asymmetry, there was like 2 or 3 studies in each subcategory. So there's not really enough data to tell us anything. We did run the stats on it. And again, because the data is quite minimal, unsurprisingly, we didn't really find much. And I think the main thing for me to take away from that is not that, oh, well, let's get more training interventions trying to reduce asymmetry. I think the smarter thing, and it's a question, it's kind of a rhetorical question, I suppose, that I'm not sure I totally have the answer to yet, is we need better designed studies that look to try and determine if I do change, my magnitude of asymmetry, do I then, perform better in, I was going to say sport, but there's so many uncontrollable variables in sport. How would you really know? Do I perform better in, surrogate measures that we know are important to sport? And there was one study that was done by an Italian author called Sanicandro. And it's quite well designed, in fairness, and it was in youth tennis players. And what he did, he did like a 6-week training intervention that it was kind of very movement based. It's here's some squats here and here's some jumps here, but he also did it on, wobble boards and stuff like that, because predominantly they were sort of 14 years old, I think, something like that. And there was a very big reduction in a couple of different jump asymmetry indexes, from like group mean data changing from 9% to 3%. But then when you looked at like sprinting and change of direction, speed, times, pre and post, they didn't get any faster, So I don't know whether there was a direct, I don't know if you can say there's a direct cause and effect there, but I can tell you that from that data, the way it was presented, they did a really good job of reducing asymmetry, but didn't make the kids any faster. So, how important is that really? I think is something for consideration. So I think when you collectively bring all that together, training interventions, associative designs, there was probably no one back in 2016 when I started my PhD going into this thinking, ooh, we're going to reduce asymmetry and it's going to make a big difference. But the evidence base is pretty weak across the board, I would say.
So given the fact that we chatted about this beforehand, you get asked a lot of questions from institutes, professional teams academies. You've got an oversight on this because people are coming to you because of what you've just described over the last 10, 12 minutes. Are people taking that and going, I'm not sure about this, like maybe we should put our resources and attention somewhere else? Or are people still kind of going down this rabbit hole and trying to understand it and spending a lot of time on it? And just to bring that to a bit of a head, do you think that it is worth diving into and going deeper and deeper and deeper? Or do you think based on your PhD, you're coming out the back end going, I'm not sure about this now?
Yeah. Good question. So I guess there's two parts to that, is what are practitioners doing? What's my sense of what practitioners are doing? And, is there anything meaningful we can kind of take from it really? Right. So I guess the discussions with practitioners over the years, my message has probably evolved a bit, as my understanding has changed. And I suppose that it wouldn't surprise me if people are still monitoring it in their, athlete management system softwares. It's a metric that they report on the dashboard or it's in their spreadsheet. I do think that from some discussions, because it does come up when I have these discussions, it comes up relatively frequently. People like the idea of a threshold, and my guess is that that gives you something binary to latch onto, to go, oh well, these guys are okay and these guys aren't. Because people, I suppose, want to maybe try and action something, but I think that's quite problematic. I've written a piece. It's actually the first ever article I wrote solo. Actually, it was just an opinion piece in NSCA's Strength and Conditioning Journal about interlimb asymmetries. Are thresholds a usable concept? And I think if you look at where the concept of thresholds has originated from, I think for the most part, it stemmed from injury-based literature where studies have suggested that if you have a 15% asymmetry, you're more likely to get injured. If you dive into the specifics in the methods about where that number comes from, some studies are quantifying normative data in healthy people, and by saying, well, the average symmetry is 85% or the average asymmetry is 15% for these healthy people, anything above that means you're at risk, which is a bit, it's a bit of a stretch to say the least, because you're not really actually investigating anyone who's injured. Lots of other people have then cited, one or two studies like that. More recently, that number seems to have gravitated and shifted to 10% in studies that have more directly looked at a link between imbalance and injury. My issue with that, I suppose, is I've already mentioned this actually, so there might be a bit of this in this podcast, so sorry about that, is the repeatability of that information. If you know that something's really noisy, there's a lot of variation, and that the outcome of asymmetry, whatever the test or whatever the metric, changes from session to session, it's almost like you ran the data, found something, but maybe due diligence would be, run it again a month later, and does it still tell you the same thing? I haven't really seen studies do that. And that's kind of my issue, so to speak, is the repeatability of something that we know is noisy. And if your data tells you something, it tells you something because it happened to tell you something at that moment in time. But for something so noisy, I would put a good chunk of money on it not showing you the same thing if you then tested for it again. So I think that's where some of the threshold concepts comes from. I also think as well, if, people very often monitor more than one metric from a given test, jumping's a really good example of that, right? They'll monitor jump height and power and RSI mod and, time to take off, whatever it might be. And if I've got this threshold of 10% or whatever it is, that means I'm at risk of injury, jump height might show an asymmetry of 11%, but all the other metrics will give me a different magnitude. And now, does that mean that jump height's my risk factor, but all the others aren't, when all they are is metrics from the same test? That can't make sense to me, right? And that's really, really common. In data, we've probably looked at nearly, I don't know how many, maybe 250 asymmetry data sets over the years. It's a very task and metric specific concept. So, how would it be possible that one metric from a given test is a risk factor, but all the other metrics from the exact same test aren't? They're not separate tests. They're just metrics that we get from, from the same test. So that in itself is also seems like a bit of a flawed concept. So how do we use the data, and is it usable, and how would I use it? Okay, so I think one of the important things that we haven't touched on yet is that it's a ratio metric, right? Which, I did mention it briefly earlier, actually, sorry, that it's, two sources of information pulled together and that increases the noise. But predominantly, most of the literature on asymmetry over the last 30 or 40 years has treated asymmetry as a single metric, but it isn't. It's a ratio. It has different parts to it, left or right, dominant, non-dominant, whatever. And I think it's really, really important to try and understand the component parts of any ratio. And the issue is not data that you collect at any one moment in time. The issue is when you try and establish or track change over time. And the reason why that's relevant is because no one in sports science collects data at one time point and just stops. We don't do that, right? We track, we look for trends, we look for change. So if an asymmetry changes from 10% to 6%, intuitively, from discussions with some people would intuitively think, well, that's good, that's heading in the right direction. Again, assuming that lower is better, right? But if I turn around and I went, how did it change? There are multiple ways that 10% can become 6%. The weaker leg could have got stronger to minimize that imbalance. The stronger leg could have got weaker, to minimize that imbalance. They both could have improved, but at different magnitudes. They both could have got worse, but at different magnitudes. And I think if the only way that you know how something changes, or you know how a ratio metric changes, is to go back and interpret the component parts, I sometimes now struggle to see a little bit what value the ratio metric holds, because it's not about data at any one time point. It's about tracking change and seeing that that's change is happening the way you think it should or the way you want it to as a practitioner for that athlete. But if I go, tell me why it changed, and you go, oh, hang on a second, let me just go back to the dominant and non-dominant scores. What's it giving you that the dominant, non-dominant scores aren't? And I feel like my way of thinking now has come round to probably the way that Franco and Pellizzeri thinks about ratios. He's probably thought this for, the best part of 15 years. He's probably sat there in Australia wondering why the rest of the world hasn't figured this out. And I feel like over the past few years, I'm starting to figure it out. But I would just say to Franco, I got there in the end, type thing. But I think the one scenario where asymmetry data might be usable is first and foremost a really important concept that Tim Excel from the University of Portsmouth came up with, is that for an asymmetry to be considered real, the interlimb percentage difference, so the between limb relative percentage value that we create, that we construct, needs to be greater than the intralimb variability. Now, if you take a single leg test, remember, you get scores on your left, you get scores on your right, you get a percentage difference if you create it, but you also get variability like, standard error measurement or coefficient of variation scores for both left and right limbs separately because it's a single leg test, right? So in a scenario like that, the asymmetry percentage or the asymmetry magnitude would need to be bigger than both left and right, measurements of error in order for that limb difference to be considered real. Okay, that's an important concept that I think he did a fantastic job of, from what I can tell, coming up with, and we've been pushing that narrative probably for the past 7 years. If you want to know whether an asymmetry is real, we always talk about signal to noise ratios in sports science. Asymmetry shouldn't be any different. Is it greater than the error in each limb? Okay, that's the first thing. If it is, you've got a real imbalance. That doesn't mean you have to correct it necessarily. It just means you've got a real imbalance. I think for imbalances that are consistently greater than the error in the test, and when I mean consistently, remembering we were talking about the variability and the repeatability of those test scores, I think if you showed an asymmetry that did two things, was greater than the error in the test over more than 2 test sessions, and showed consistency in directionality. So now we're going back to the component parts, and I consistently have an underperforming limb. My right leg is stronger than my left in test session 1, and that difference is greater than my variability on each limb. I test in test session 2. It's fluctuated a little bit, but it's still greater than the error. This is still underperforming, and again, you now have a consistently underperforming real asymmetry because of that one weaker or less superior limb. Those are the people I would suggest actually probably might require further investigation. I'm not saying you have to run an intervention or anything like that, but I think that probably very little bad would come from giving a consistently weaker limb more capacity. What happens if you give a limb more capacity? It probably means it can tolerate more stress and more load and more strain. That's probably not a bad thing. That probably reduces the likelihood of that limb breaching its tolerance capacity for load. And then all you're giving is an athlete the ability to handle more training and reduce the likelihood of non-contact repetitive stress trauma or something to that effect. So that's probably the scenario where I think people should be looking at asymmetry data, and that lends itself to me saying, right, you probably should look at it in your monitoring. You probably should have it in your spreadsheet, but those scenarios are probably the only time I might consider taking a deeper dive and trying to consider whether something needs to be actioned.
With the kind of emergence of and the affordability of force plates, dual force plates. I don't know if you'd agree or definitely more this area than I do, but the majority of people will be looking at asymmetries from a counter movement, using a counter movement jump. Would that be right?
Yeah, I think it's a very common test to be used. Yeah, absolutely.
Is it the right test to be used? Or is there better alternatives? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, okay. So I suppose I'll answer it in two parts, if that's all right. The first part I'll answer relating to asymmetry and force plates, and the second part I'll answer a bit more broader about metric selection, if that's okay. So I think the first thing to consider when we're testing on force plates is I would always go back to the needs and the demands of the sport, the training history of the athlete, to try and comprehend whether the test is first and foremost right in that scenario and for that person. Now, jump testing is really commonly used because typically it's very quick, time efficient. It's a good expression of lower body ballistic force production, and it tends to be a decent proxy measurement that correlates pretty well with other important physical performance measures like how fast you run and change of direction, speed times and velocity and things like that. So it's definitely got some use, from a monitoring perspective for sure. Probably all jump testing to some degree. I think when we're considering asymmetry specifically, I think it's worth bringing in that, and this stems from some really excellent work that Dan Cohen's put out there in a special issue of the Aspertar Sports Medicine Journal. I hadn't considered this when I read it, and it's another big narrative I push now. Firstly, should we be testing bilaterally or should we be testing unilaterally? Because of course you can do both on force plates, right? Now, you go back to the needs analysis of the sport, and it'd probably be quite easy in some team sport scenarios to go, well, we could probably pick both. It doesn't really matter that much, unless you have a particular affinity or you think there's a problem with doing single leg jumping with your athletes for whatever reason. But Dan pointed out that if I test bilaterally, unsurprisingly, my movement velocity is much higher than, or much greater than, when I jump on one leg. And that's because I get to spread my body mass through two limbs. I'm a lot more stable. And when I stand on one limb, I now have to support all my body mass without any help. Therefore, things like takeoff velocity are much, much slower on one leg than they are off of two legs. Okay, so as a consequence of that, because you don't get any support on one leg from the other limb, you essentially, I think single leg tests are probably a better measure of true limb capacity. Whereas when I'm on two legs, because I'm spreading the load on my body mass through two legs, you probably have a better understanding of compensation strategies in a movement. The movement being the jump in this instance, right? So if someone has a tweak or an injury, if I'm testing on two legs, I might see, offloading away from that injured side more obviously because, I have two limbs interacting with the ground. Therefore, it's easy for me to do that. On one leg, I don't have, the other leg's not in contact with the ground. There's no direct ground reaction force contribution from that other limb. It has to do all of the work. Therefore, it's forced to do all the capacity, so to speak, right? So single leg tests are a better measure of true capacity, I think. Double leg tests are probably a better indication of different compensation strategies during that particular task. And I think it depends on what you want to look at. There's probably arguments for both. But I think the important thing to appreciate is they give you different information. Okay. I also think as well, this is a bit nerdy and a bit statsy, and I'll try and keep it simple. But I also think that because on a two-legged task, you have two legs interacting with the ground, and in a one-legged task, you don't. I think my personal opinion, and it's only opinion, is that I would quantify those limb differences differently. Okay, if I wanted to understand how to calculate an asymmetry from a two-legged test, my opinion is that we should be quantifying the difference between limbs relative to the total, output or total force, whatever metric I'm monitoring, because, both limbs are interacting together to produce a sum total force of 1200 newtons. And one might be producing 650 and one might be producing 550. But there is a total output there of 1200 newtons. So I think it makes sense to look at the difference, that 100 Newton difference relative to 1200 newtons, because that's the output that is given. In a single leg task, however, you don't have both limbs interacting with the ground. So I might produce 750 newtons on my right and 650 newtons on my left. I don't think that means that we need to, quick maths here, I don't think that means we need to interpret the difference relative to 1400 newtons. I think that 100 Newton difference is then computed relative to 750, the larger value, just because that is how fractions are calculated. And asymmetry is a percentage difference. Percentage difference is a fraction. Anyone who's read some of those calculation pieces we've written, there's like 9 or 10 different equations you can use to calculate asymmetry. Well, I definitely didn't learn 9 ways to do fractions in math class when I was 12. I only learned one way to do it. So I don't totally understand where some of those have come from or why you would do that. I do know that for a bilateral test, I would choose one of those different equations, and I would choose the one where we interpret the difference relative to the sum total value. And for the single leg tasks, I would choose the one that just aligns to how you create fractions, basically. But I think that whether you test bilaterally, whether you test unilaterally, just appreciating they give you different information, and both might be worthwhile, or you might decide that only one of them is worthwhile, depending on your scenario. And then I think you asked about, that was a bit long-winded, sorry, mate, but
it's all right.
And then you asked about sort of general metric selection and the counter movement jump and whether it's the right test and things like that. So I guess to go back to something I just said at the beginning of that first part, typically it's it's used as a proxy measurement. It's sometimes used for different purposes. People use it for performance profiling and correlating jump height or something else with how fast people run, or a strength test. And usually that correlation, that magnitude is reasonable. It's moderate to large and sometimes very large, and that gives you a basis for saying it's a half decent proxy measurement. But that's more often than not just been done with outcome measures data like jump height, which is fine. I think there are other reasons we can use a test, like during return to play for injured athletes, and also for neuromuscular readiness or fatigue monitoring seems to be quite a big vogue thing, in the last sort of 15, 20 years. And Rob Gathercole's done some really, really cool research on this, about the use of sort of jump and field-based tests to detect, when scores return to baseline after athletes are put through a grueling workout or a fatiguing protocol. I think that's okay and has some value. My only sort of slight caveat to that is we as a profession have recognized, rightly so, that there are a bunch of different ways that an athlete can perform a counter movement jump to achieve the same outcome. And we see that in some of those fatiguing protocols that people like Rob Gathercole has done, which is, well, if jump height is determined by impulse, and impulse is force multiplied by time, if I'm knackered, I might not be able to really change how much force I produce. I might even, because of fatigue, potentially have a very small drop off in how much force I produce in a jump. But that's okay, because I'll just dip a bit lower. I'll just take a little longer to do it. I'll stretch the force time curve out so that I get this positive effect on impulse, which helps me to manipulate how I did my jump, and I still achieve the same jump height, right? And I think that's something that we've rightly recognized, that how an athlete performs a jump is important just as much, maybe in some scenarios even more, than how high they jump. Jump height is always going to be important. It's a jump test. And it's also the metric that your key stakeholders get. Like no coach comes up and goes, what's their impulse? And you go, oh, it's 250 Newton seconds. And they go, oh, goody. No one does that. And athletes don't understand that. They understand jump height. It'll always be important. But if there are lots and lots and lots of different ways that when athletes are tired, and for clarity, we're talking about, fatigue monitoring and neuromuscular readiness and things like that. If there are lots of different ways that an athlete can change what they do to still achieve the same outcome, you've got a lot of different ways that you have to search really hard to find, meaningful change, I think is an important thing. Remembering that earlier we were talking about, it's not just about data at any one time point. It's about tracking change, because that's what we do in sports science, and looking for trends. Well, if you've got lots of different ways of, achieving the same outcome, you probably now have to search quite hard to find, true change in some of your variables or some of the metrics that you're monitoring. And I think that raises the question of, how hard should we be having to look to find meaningful change? And if your metrics are not showing meaningful change during scenarios where we know our athletes are, tired and where their performance is dropping off, what value is that, metric giving you? And I think we've got very reliant on jump testing being a test of convenience, because it's quick and it's time efficient and it gives us some information. And I don't think that's entirely a bad thing. But I do think for a test where we can achieve the same outcome a number of different ways, we have to take deeper and deeper dives to go, oh yeah, found something. This metric shows change. When maybe actually, would it be so bad if we just picked a test that was technically a bit harder, and you didn't have to search so hard to find meaningful change? And I spoke to you earlier before we came on, and a few other people, about, I definitely think some guys at the Institute, back in the early 2000s, were using the drop jump for a similar purpose. Now, I appreciate the purpose of the test is very different to the counter movement jump. One is slow stretch shortening cycle where, we get a lot of joint flexion and muscles are doing a lot of work. One is a test that typically, if you do the bounce drop jump type test, where we're trying to absorb a much stiffer strategy and we want the tendon to do much more of the work and the muscle to work isometrically. Now, so I know they have very different purposes, but to use those two as an example, the drop jump is technically much, much harder. And I think for a harder technical task, there are less ways you can cheat the test. There are less strategies that you can use to achieve the same outcome. And you probably then have to search a little less hard to find true change. And I think that's just something, that practitioners, some practitioners definitely doing. I think it's something that, all of us, me included, can think about, if I have to just keep hunting and diving through force plate, metrics, how hard do I really want to look to be able to prove that something changed? Are we now getting away from, the value and the purpose the test had originally, just to show that something changed, when really, is it the right test in the first instance? And if the purpose of your test is X, then, stay true to that purpose and just maybe pick something that's more appropriate, potentially. And again, that's not a counter movement jump is inappropriate or anything like that. I also think the value of the metrics, and we were talking about this off air, weren't we, about us saying, well, I run a correlation with a different physical performance test or a surrogate measure, and the correlation's pretty strong, so it tells me it has some value as a proxy measurement. We've also seen quite a lot, recently, of lots and lots of correlations being run between outcome measures and loads of different strategy metrics from jump tests. And I think it's, people shouldn't be surprised that a strategy metric doesn't really correlate that strongly with another outcome measure. That's definitely what the literature says so far. And intuitively, I don't understand why it would. If I say, I want to correlate how fast you do a 40-meter sprint time with like peak braking RFD or something to that effect. And I'm not totally dogging that metric, although I don't really believe in it. Why do people expect peak, one single instantaneous moment of braking rate of force development, to correlate really strongly with how fast you run? Because how fast you run is quantified either in velocity or just how long it took you to do that 40-meter sprint. If you want to see a strong correlation between an outcome measure like velocity or time from another proxy test, just pick another outcome measure, because outcome measures correlate with outcome measures. I don't think outcome measures always correlate that strongly with, very nuanced, discrete, strategy-based metrics. So I think that's something that is also worth thinking about. And when we think about us as, think about that concept and take it tangibly to the field for people who maybe don't have force plates and the only thing they've got are a set of timing gates and a jump mat. You typically only get outcome measures based data from that. You only get how fast they ran in your timing gate orientated tests, and you got how high they did the jump, and maybe I can get contact time and RSI. Those are, for the most part, outcome measures based data. Don't feel like if that's all you've got, you should be having to take a deeper dive into metrics that, one, you can't properly get, and two, probably aren't going to correlate really that well with how fast your athletes run, because we already know that how fast someone runs and change of direction is a really prominent action during team sports. So, those are valuable tests. And the fact that you're only quantifying time or velocity, those are valuable metrics, because it's in every athlete's interest to be faster than their opponents, So if you're only then going, well, look, the only metrics we've got are outcome measures here, outcome measures here, and outcome measures here, that's okay. You've got similar purpose metrics from different tests, and they will probably still help to inform you. Yes, you won't get as much detailed information as a force plate, but equally taking, the outcome from a different test and correlating it against, 50 different metrics from a force plate, just because I have a force plate, is also absolutely not the right thing to do.
So you've kind of done my work for me here. This has been great, because you've kind of taken it from an asymmetry conversation to a broader force plate conversation, which expertly done. Just going to dive into your choosing the right metrics paper that I don't know how long ago that was, 6 months?
About a year, something like that.
Oh, was it? Oh, wow. Jeez. Okay, about a year ago. And in there, you and the fellow authors describe certain metrics that you could, more valuable metrics that you use from a profiling, neuromuscular fatigue, and a rehab scenario. Would you be able to give us a bit of a rundown of that, and maybe your opinion based on your thinking since then? Because there'll be plenty of people out there who have, like I said about the affordability of force plates, that get a force plate and then go, oh, okay, I've got these 400, 300, 200 metrics or whatever. Where do I go? And I want to answer these specific questions. How do I package that up and go, I think these 3 are the ones for me when it comes to this. These 4 are the ones for me when it comes to this. And I guess that's what the paper was about, but it's just to get your thoughts and kind of build that out, if that's all right.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So the premise of that piece was that, and I think we talk about, we use the counter movement jump as as an example, as a vessel for that piece, but theoretically, if you can do it for any jump test, really. The premise of that piece is, you might use the same test for a different purpose, right? You might use it, just as we were talking about, for, we call it performance profiling, right? Which is basically just these are my metrics that I choose to establish whether they're getting better at a jump test from a performance perspective. Or these are the metrics that I choose, like I just said, to then correlate to another surrogate measure of performance for my athletes. We then also suggested that some people, and as I alluded to earlier from some of the work that people like Rob Gathercole have done, will use jump testing and the counter movement jump for neuromuscular fatigue or readiness to determine, when do my scores get back to baseline if my athletes are tired or fatigued. And then also, things like the counter movement jump is embedded into return to play testing batteries for injured athletes. So we've got the same test, but might be being used for different purposes. And we sort of indicate or suggest, it's just an opinion piece really, that you might not choose the same metrics for every scenario, right? Like if you want to know if my athletes are performing their best, then from a performance perspective, take really strong performance related metrics, right? Like jump height. Some of those metrics are probably going to be a bit fluffier. I think, people like Jason Lake and John McMahon might say. So jump height is going to be important because it's a jump test. Power, assuming that you know how the power is being created, peak or mean power, it might be a useful metric to monitor. I don't know, I might get some backlash for this, but I feel like we've got really preoccupied ever since the late Professor Ed Winter wrote that piece on the misuse of power in sports science, which I think lots of people have read. We've got really preoccupied with power being a bad metric in sports science. It's like people saw a Twitter debate and they read that paper and now they think power's terrible. Power's a product of force and velocity. All movement is underpinned by force production. And because in sport we have time constraints, being able to produce force quickly is really, really important. So how could power be a bad metric? I just think we need to know that what you're monitoring is true mechanical power. That's all. So I think power is a useful metric. Obviously jump height, potentially, impulse as well, because impulse is the thing that drives how high someone jumps, okay, in that scenario. And, those could be really, really useful performance related metrics. From a neuromuscular fatigue purpose, we sort of took a bit of a deep dive again into some of Rob Gathercole's research, but a couple other papers. And the scenario I described earlier was that I've just played a 90-minute soccer match. Soccer, listen to me, crikey. That deserves to be thrown off the podcast,
scandalous,
doesn't it? That is scandalous.
Right, cut.
Yeah, cut. See you later, mate. A 90-minute football match. And, I played all 90 minutes. I covered 11K, in the game. And, there's some pretty strong tissue damage there, for the foreseeable, couple of days. I then want to try and determine whether my athletes, pre-match jump scores that I might have tested, 1 or 2 days earlier, come back to baseline, on Monday afternoon when they come into the gym, roughly 48 hours. They might just take a different strategy to achieve the same outcome. And what we found is athletes just need more time to produce force in order to produce the same outcome. So time-related metrics on a force time curve seem to definitely hold some value, in terms of fatigue monitoring. And that could be something as simple as time to take off. It could be you might break up the different phases of the jump prior to takeoff into braking and propulsive phases and start looking at braking duration, propulsive duration, and things like that. So time-orientated metrics, I think, definitely have some value for sure. And I think as a consequence of that, if you wanted somewhat an outcome measure to go hand in hand with that, you could choose reactive strength index modified, which is jump height divided by time to take off, knowing that if you're performance profiling as well, you're already monitoring jump height. So if you're already monitoring jump height and then you start looking at duration, you can get RSI mod, and that almost serves as like your outcome measure for neuromuscular fatigue monitoring as well, because you've already got jump height going on. And then from an injury-based perspective, you also asked what my thinking is since then. And I'll tell you what my thinking is when we wrote the paper, and it has ever so slightly changed off the back of a conversation with Simon Brearley, who people should definitely connect with. He's a really, really, really smart dude. So what we kind of indicated was that if you go back and look at some of the ACL injury mechanistic type investigations, and some people who work at FIFA, like I'm going to get this name wrong. I think it's someone Della Via. I don't know if his name's Franco or Frank or something, Francois, or I'm just digging myself a hole now. I don't know his first name, but his surname's Della Via. He's kind of done a lot of analysis of videos, right, to determine the root cause of a non-contact ACL injury. And there's a few different reasons, but one of those reasons is landing awkwardly, from going up from a header, or landing awkwardly, when you press and try and put a tackle and your opponent gets past you and now you're off balance and all that sort of thing. So there's definitely landing orientated movements or tasks which can be problematic and cause injuries in team sport athletes. And I believe, some similar stuff has been shown in rugby from an author called Montgomery, who showed that for non-contact injuries, landing during cutting and change of direction tasks are a big problem, dependent on the kind of whole orientation of your body during that movement. So landing is an issue, or has the capacity to be an issue, I think, from an injury perspective. So maybe landing orientated metrics like landing force and things like landing impulse, and maybe even asymmetry data, within the context of what we spoke about earlier, might definitely have their place potentially. My chat with Simon, which I didn't really think about it at the time, and in fairness, none of us who were creating that paper did. Simon kind of rightly sort of said, well, if you think about how the time it takes for an ACL injury to occur, it's really low in the milliseconds, isn't it? We're talking like, I'm going to paraphrase something that, your Tim Hewitts and your Greg Myers are probably going to shoot me for, because maybe I'll get the data wrong. But isn't it something like 50 milliseconds is when the injury, happens? It's almost instantaneous upon contact. And Simon was like, he was really nice and complimentary about the paper. I get on really well with Simon. But he was like, if you think about how an injury like that occurs, there's no measurement in your return to play or injury column, or no metric for like, an assessment of ballistic force production, like an RFD, which I think is highly problematic, for example. And it got me thinking. I was like, and I just, when I was chatting, it was just a WhatsApp discussion, and I hold my hands up. I was like, that's a really good point, Simon. None of us thought of that. I would have given that a lot more due diligence if someone had said that to me when we were writing the paper. So, maybe some sort of measurement of force at a given time point, or I'm not saying I would do an RFD. I definitely don't think I would do an RFD during a jump. My experience of looking into that is that it's a really, really noisy metric, pretty poor and pretty high CVs, pretty irregular and inconsistent values from trial to trial and session to session. And I think, when your bandwidth for natural variability on a metric like that is so wide, your ability to establish meaningful change is very, very difficult. Plus, the number itself, when we quantify that bandwidth, tells us that that metric's not reliable. But I think you could take Simon's notion and maybe apply that to maybe a different test. If you did like an isometric, mid-thigh pull, for example, everyone monitors peak force. Lots of people have monitored RFD over the years in those types of isometric tests, which I think is problematic and really unreliable. It almost only just about starts to level out, in my opinion, at about 300 milliseconds from an isometric task. And I know we're sort of slightly going off tangent here, but even then, it's still questionable reliability at that time frame. And at 300 milliseconds and beyond, the determinants of force production at that point are basically the same as the determinants for peak force. So you can measure, force or RFD at this window near 300 milliseconds. You're not really getting the determinants of how force is being produced at 300 is not really any different to the determinants of how force is produced at peak force value, whether that's 1.2 seconds on the force time curve, 0.8 seconds. So to answer that, what would I change now? Although it's a different test, I see value in practitioners may be looking at force at different time points in something like an isometric mid-thigh pull for injury rehabilitation purposes, because at something like 75 or 100 milliseconds, the determinants of force production there are highly neural, whereas once you get after 100, they become a lot more sort of muscular contractile properties, creating that value. So assuming that force production at 100 milliseconds is consistent and reliable, and I think it's borderline, but in some cases I think it is reliable, that could be a really, really useful metric. And the reliability probably just stems down from how familiar people are with the test, and making sure that they do it and get the same instructions, have had a lot of practice, done it a few times and things like that. So I don't think we could take a comparable metric like force at 100 milliseconds, force at 75 milliseconds, and do that in a jump, because I just think it's too much going on. It's complex, it's dynamic. The error and the noise is high on that, in my opinion. But maybe taking that notion Simon describes, because of how early an ACL injury happens from a time perspective, and applying it in something like an isometric multi-joint strength task, that has value, I think, from a return to play injury perspective, and probably something that isn't done a lot in injury-based research. Normally what we see is injury-based research go right straight onto the isokinetic dynamometer. Let's start looking at torque and rate of torque development in the quads and the hamstrings in loads of different contraction velocities, and that's probably right to do that. But at some point, transitioning into a multi-joint isometric task before the athlete is back training, but still during their rehabilitation journey, and looking at, those early force time points as well as peak force, would probably hold some value. So it was a really useful chat with Simon. I don't think I'd be able to necessarily apply it in a jump scenario, but in an isometric test, perhaps.
Perfect. Right. I promised you an hour, so I'm going to stick to that, as I do with everyone, so I'm going to stick to that promise. But if anyone wants to dive deeper into any of the papers that you've mentioned, your future research, your thoughts, where's the best place?
Probably ResearchGate, truthfully. It's like a sort of largely open access repository for anyone. I used to just call it Facebook for nerds, really, is what I've always referred to it as. But yeah, probably just go on to ResearchGate. You can even contact me on email, which is c.bishop@mdx.ac.uk. Feel free. I'll always respond. And the other thing I was going to say is, I guess, just through Twitter, if you wanted to as well.
Yeah. Happy days. We missed out the UKSCA chat, which I'm sure you're very pleased with. Not because you're not interested, but because you probably get peppered with it all the time. So I won't add to the peppering when it comes to UKSCA. So really appreciate your time, mate. It's been a pleasure to get you on. Absolute masterclass. So thank you very much.
Cheers, bud. Thanks very much. Really enjoyed the chat, and thanks for the invite.
My pleasure. Thanks, mate.